Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So today we're going to continue the series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and I bet you weren't expecting to see a CDI core playing actual games today, but it is here, it is working, it is glitchy, and it is amazing. Just be aware this is a part 1, I've got so many different captures to show you. If you want to see a part 2, leave me a comment down below, but I had to keep this thing around 15 minutes so we didn't lose track. And before we get too far involved, go down below, hit like, subscribe, and all that jazz, because we got a lot of CDI stuff to talk about, because it is so wild that it is actually working. But the core maker Slamy here has been working on this for maybe like a couple months that we've known about, and I meant to mention it in the last news episode, but I forgot to include the footage when it was just loading the boot ROM. Now, if you can't tell already, we're getting in-game on some CDI titles. Now, I want you to be very well aware this is very still much a work-in-progress core, kind of the same way that the Nintendo 64 core basically would play just a few games with some graphical corruption when we first saw it release. So don't expect to be able to play any CDI games from start to finish. If you start playing one and actually see the credits scroll, you would just be incredibly lucky. We're not at that stage yet. But playing something like Hotel Mario here, one of the better games on this CDI, in motion, this just looks like the game you would expect it to. It is not going to be the norm for most of the games here. There's going to be a lot of graphical corruption and other issues, but Hotel Mario, at least if you paused it, seems like everything is working totally fine. It may be running a little bit fast. It is hard to tell because honestly most people's experience with CDI is just knowing it exists. But you will see here we end up going through the next stage and then the game will eventually freeze. I also want you to be aware that there's no music in this video as far as the gameplay is concerned because there is not yet any audio incorporated into the actual core. You're going to be playing this thing on mute the entire time you're checking it out, but honestly that is exciting in and of itself to actually get a chance to play this as it develops. And do be aware this is not going to run on update all. You have to go to MiSTer Discord, go to the CDI channel, and check out the pinned messages. You'll get the actual RBF core file there, but this will not show up on any updaters probably until it's very close to done, if not completely done. But honestly, it is just wild to see something like this work, even if it does end up freezing, saying the disk may be dirty. Apparently the bits in this ISO are dirty as hell. A big thanks to Andy D as well as those posters for helping with some of the captures on this video. It happened over the weekend and they sent me over some footage to incorporate into this actual cut. As we move on to Zelda the Wand of Gamelon, another famous for good and bad reasons game on the CDI, you will see here that at least in this full motion video intro, everything does seem to be working correctly. This is one of those situations though, it'll work correctly until it completely stops working. You'll never quite know when it's going to freeze. And honestly, this is such a vibe, and if you're not aware, the reason that there are Nintendo games on this CDI is back in the day, Nintendo had that deal with Sony to make the Super Nintendo CD. That fell apart, and then they made a deal with Philips to make a CD attachment for Super Nintendo. When that fell apart, Philips got the rights to release some Nintendo properties on their own hardware as long as they develop the games, so you end up with something like the Wand of Gamelon or Hotel Mario. Basically just a business deal that went sideways, ended up with Nintendo games on a console not owned by Nintendo, and you don't really see that very often whatsoever. But actually running that full motion video, getting into game, everything loading up is impressive here, so much so that this core is actually titled Wand of Gamelon, probably because the developer wanted to see this game run first. And again, it seems like it might be running a little bit fast, but we're not at the stage at this point in time to actually care about how it's functioning. We mostly just care that it functions in and of itself, and you'll see here in real time, if you go out to the overworld, that's how long it takes to load up the map, but I'd have to check real captures to see how long the CDI takes to load. And this is definitely, again, quite the experience. I'm not saying it's the best Zelda game of all time. I'm not saying it's the worst either. I'm just saying it's a Zelda that exists that you can now play, at least in part, on MiSTer FPGA. And it's not like many people out there own CDI hardware. I do not, so I have nothing to show you in the intro like I usually do. This honestly is probably going to be the de facto way that most people play CDI moving forward into the future. But that is awesome. Even if it's not the best console of all time, every single console from this generation deserves to come over to FPGA, and there are fans out there for pretty much any platform you can think of, and that's the other half of MiSTer FPGA. Sure, we get stuff like Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, and PlayStation 1, some of the most popular consoles of all time, but MiSTer is as much a preservation project as it is just a way for you to play the games you love. Now in the future, if you want to actually check out quote-unquote real CDI hardware, you will have a core that's replicating that hardware able to play on MiSTer FPGA. And honestly, even though this game's animations might not be the prettiest things in the world, I do love how they are overlaid. It is charming, and it is a total vibe that you should definitely check out if you want to test this core. Now moving on to another game you can definitely play and start to enjoy, and it's also very interesting and kind of funny outside of the CDI-ness of it all, is going to be arcade classics from Namco. If you don't remember, about 2 years ago when the Nintendo 64 core first started playing retail games, the first game to boot and actually be playable was Namco Collection. That's because it only ever used the CPU on the Nintendo 64, didn't use the RSP or RDP chips, so it is not lost on pretty much everyone who's been testing and playing around with MiSTer for years that the next console core to start development, one of the first games playable, is also a Namco title. Just a little fun history lesson for MiSTer FPGA. Now moving on to Miss Pac-Man here, I am showing you the loading in real time just so you understand what to expect, and this is another game that is just working and you can just play and enjoy. Now obviously there's tons of different ways to play Miss Pac-Man and MiSTer FPGA. The CDI version is never going to be the de facto best way to play, but it does work and it does give you an example of what is functioning and what isn't on the current core. Because as far as the graphics are concerned, everything looks good here. I don't see any glitches. There probably should be a background. I did look at some real footage and saw that there was an overlay, but otherwise, outside of the fact that you're getting no audio in the core whatsoever currently, it is playing a CDI game. It seems to be close to, if not the proper speed, and everything as far as the gameplay logic is working. Eat that pellet, eat some scared ghosts, move on with your day. It is just exactly what you would expect if you played this, so that is awesome to see. But do be aware, not every single game is actually going to be working the way it should. Right now we're trying to load up Golgo 13, and this is one of those posers captures. Thanks for sending that in. And you'll see here that we do get the developer splash screen. It's going to fade to black, and I'm actually going to cut this short because it takes like 20 seconds. And now we're going to get the title screen for Golgo 13, and I absolutely love the artwork here on that skull. It looks awesome, and this is still executing until the title screen comes up, and that is as far as the game is going to get you. I tested this in the background, was never able to get any further, so do expect this core to freeze often and to freeze early. If it doesn't freeze in the first 30 seconds or a minute, you should be fine to get some gameplay in, but a lot of these titles actually don't get to the gameplay stage. And what would a CDI video be without talking about Rise of the Robots? We talked about it for the Amiga CD32 games playable on the Amiga Mini Mid-Core. Anytime we can mention Rise of the Robots, we definitely have to. And you'll see here the splash screen does come up. All of the FMV animations are playing, although they do seem to be running way too fast in comparison to what I remember them being. So it seems like maybe the clock speeds or the overall performance here on the core is just faster than it would be on real hardware. But if you own a CDI, you tell me what you think the speed here should be, because honestly, I don't know anyone in my friend circle on Discord or otherwise that owns this hardware, so it really is hard for me to actually chat with somebody to talk about what the real performance would look like. But these animated sequences do work. They like to hitch and freeze up, but you will get past them to the point in time where you can actually start seeing some of the menu system right before you get to the gameplay. And Rise of the Robots is a total vibe. This thing got ported to basically every platform back in the day, and CDI was no different. The game definitely didn't succeed at retail. It wasn't very good, and it seems like they tried to make their money back by releasing this thing on any platform that they could possibly think of. You'll see here that it is trying to load up here into an actual match. You're going to get this text scroll, and I did leave the garbage on the screen so you can see what it looks like, but that it is going to freeze. You're not going to be able to go any further than this, at least on this core. Now moving over to Tetris, one of the more well-known games on the CDI, and it is Tetris, so you know it's going to be fun. This one you can totally get into the game. You'll see here the actual menu that Tetris logo animates. You can see the other selections, but you are going to get a lot of this dot crawl and otherwise graphical garbo at the bottom of the screen. But as far as playing Tetris is concerned, that animated background is there. You can pause the game. You can do everything you would normally do in Tetris. And that's how impressive this core is for the first revision of this actually loading up and playing games. And this is very far along. I know it doesn't seem it, I know it doesn't look it, but when you actually get to the point in time where you're executing code and playing games, that means you have a good handle on the hardware. And I did actually just crop into the footage here to get rid of that flashing at the bottom of the screen, just in case anybody is sensitive to it. So some of these things here will have garbage that I'm not showing you just because they really did flash at a very rapid rate. But I mean, again, not going to be the best version of Tetris ever, but it is going to be a version that you can play now today on the CDI core. I don't really think anyone expected to actually see a CDI core at any point in time on MiSTer FPGA, so getting something like this is just so fun to see. That leaves us with basically 3DO and PCFX as the two consoles from this generation that haven't seen any work on MiSTer FPGA, and both of them definitely deserve to be here. Obviously 3DO being my leading contender for the core I want to see the most, but you leave me a comment down below and you tell me what is the one core on MiSTer that doesn't currently exist that you would love to see come over. I would be curious. But do be aware that not every single game is going to actually allow you to get any gameplay in. This is Laser Lords here, and you're going to see we get that splash screen from the developers. You can see what looks like a title here, and you can actually get into this heads-up display. Even though you really can't see much in the background, you get a couple words, but if you select anything whatsoever, that is it. The core is going to freeze. You're never going to get into the game, so your mileage may vary, and there's such strange things on CDI as well. You know, I'm not here to make fun of any console. I love them all for what they do. This is Girls Club. I have absolutely no idea what it's supposed to be. I did look it up in the background and even still wasn't quite sure what it was supposed to actually be trying to accomplish, but you can at least see this amazing 90s Saved by the Bell ripoff intro sequence here. And I will say that pretty much of any console from this era, this CDI 100% embodies that weird 90s aesthetic early, in fact, where everything had to look like this or else it wasn't going to be appealing to anybody. And if you did not grow up with stuff like Saved by the Bell and you don't remember the intro, definitely look that up. It is maybe the most 90s thing you can possibly imagine outside of Y2K, and obviously that was at the end of 1999. But this is just an example of some of the other software that does exist on the CDI. There are games, and there are games that are worth playing, but there's a lot of other kind of like interactive quote-unquote entertainment that will definitely work on the core in the future, but will just be there for curiosity's sake. And that is the fun thing about these cores. You can just play around with them and experience some of these titles just to see what was actually going on back then. It's as much as a time warp into the history of gaming as it is actually playing games, and while I'm sure one day Girls Club will be 100% playable, it's probably not something that many people are actually going to want to play in and of itself. So do be aware, you're definitely going to have some hit or miss titles here. But depending on what you're testing, you're going to see more or less of the actual graphics. I'm sure that's down to the fact that the CDI, just like any other piece of hardware, has different calls to the hardware and different functions implemented in different games. You can obviously see this doctor here running a little bit fast again, but whatever is in the background is not displaying, and you do get all of this garbage at the bottom of the screen. So as the core evolves, this will definitely be good footage to go back and check on to see what has been added in. And again, this isn't going to be like Nintendo 64 where we have a lot of different games to test. The CDI library isn't that big, and that's where the game ends up freezing. And this is a mini golf game, The Wacky World of Miniature Golf, one of the more well-known games again on the CDI, at least as far as I know the library, and it actually has a pretty charming animated intro here with some decent art, definitely better than what the Wand of Gamelon was doing as far as their artwork was concerned. Has some loose Futurama vibes there, kind of looks like a robot from the background. And you can kind of play this game. I definitely wouldn't call it playable, but it is experienceable, and I actually really like the colorways and the overall menu they established here. It does have a vibe, something different, and I always love that Andy D puts in my initials. He should just put in Andy there so he gets the credit for doing this capture. But again, it is just kind of fun to see these things in action. And again, if you want to see a part 2, leave me a comment down below, because I've got so many other games I could show, but I knew a 30-minute CDI testing video probably wasn't going to be all that popular past like minute 10. I'm sure a lot of people are going to watch it for the curiosity, but I'm not sure how many people are actually going to be quote-unquote excited to actually play this game. Especially when, again, the CD is dirty. We have to take it out of the disk drive and clean it off, and that's not true at all, because again, we're using files here. What this means is there's probably just a loading issue, and the game, if it couldn't load data, thought that the CD was dirty or unreadable, and that's why you're seeing the same warning message in the core. It's just not ingesting the data that quickly, but I do love that docks and just running around the back there when you have that golf hole in the fence. But that's the current situation with the current Philips CDI core, a core that I don't think anyone ever expected to come to MiSTer FPGA, but is now here. It is running games, and some of them would be quote-unquote playable. Leave me a comment down below and tell me, have you ever played a real CDI before? Do you own one in your collection? And if you do, what would be the favorite game of yours? Because definitely for me, I have nothing CDI on my shelf, so I don't really know much about it. But short of that, we'll be back with more CDI next time something happens, but we'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.